we go. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to Art Forum. If you don't know me, my name's David Sequeira and I'm the director of the Margaret Lawrence Gallery, and I'm also the person that gets to organise Art Forum. And before we begin, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are gathered, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And to acknowledge that for generations before the Victorian College of the Arts, before any museum or art studio was built here, that the traditional custodians practiced song and dance and ceremony and visual arts, and that these traditions continue today. And I especially welcome any Indigenous attendees of this session. I also want to let you know that this session of Art Forum is being co-presented by the Victorian College of the Arts and the University of Melbourne's Melbourne Reconciliation Network. Now to our guest, Tony Albert. Artist Tony Albert is a Kuku Yalanji man born in Townsville, Queensland, and living and working in Sydney, although I understand Tony's in Brisbane right now. He was a founding member of the Queensland Indigenous art collective proppaNOW and works across a range of media. All aspects of his practice, including object-based assemblages, painting, photography, video and installation, provide a powerful response to the misrepresentation of Australia's First People in popular and collectible imagery. Concerned with identity and the ascribing of social labels, his practice explores contemporary legacies of colonialism. Recent projects include Visible 2018, a major survey of his work at the Gallery of Modern Art, Brisbane, and his poignant installation Healing Land, Remembering Country in NIRIN, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney. Please, wherever you are, welcome Tony Albert.
Oh, thank you very much. It's an honour to be here. So yes, normally work in Sydney, living and working in Sydney for the past decade now, but I am a Brisbane boy, and that's kind of where I found myself during these times, closer to family. I have made several attempts to head back to Sydney, which have been unsuccessful. However, yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, from Brisbane, Turrbal in Yagara country.
Great. Tony, I want to start the conversation off with a quote that you use, which is, "Invisible is my favourite colour." And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that or expand on that quote a bit.
Sure, because it completely makes no sense. However, it's nonsensical and yet so full of meaning at the same time. And I think it really sums up the tension between the visible and the invisible. And I guess throughout my life where I feel that I have sat within that spectrum. And it's a search for historical truth. It's about understanding what we read, but where that comes from. It's an understanding of how to pull something apart. It's kind of been a ongoing mantra throughout my career because, and I think a big thing for me is collaboration, and it's through honestly taking time to understand someone else through their voice, not I guess a reinterpretation or understanding of what you think, but it's actually being with someone that, you know, I think there's that real idea of, and the, pardon the pun, closing the gap, which I don't really love as a word, but the understanding of those differences in bringing us closer together. And to me, that's the tension between visible and invisible. And it's really at the core and heart of not only my work, but I think a lot about who I actually am.
Mm-hmm. Well, with this body of work, Optimism, I understand that's your cousin, and the basket that we see is your aunt's basket. Is that right?
It is, yes.
Yeah. So look, for me, there's this sense of, I don't know, claiming something with this body of work. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, you know, how this series was set up and you know, what it took to get to this point where you're involving members of your family in your practice.
And interestingly, I guess coming back to Brisbane and sitting in Brisbane at the same time, this photographic work was all shot in Brisbane and within a 3K radius of where I was living at the time. So my cousin came down from North Queensland. We are using cultural objects attached to who we are as people and reclaiming those objects. They're objects that I own, and at the time I was using. I was really interested in, you know, why do I have a backpack or these other items when we have a cultural object pertaining and used for these specific purposes. It's the basket itself is called a Jawan. It's referenced as a bicorneal basket and is completely unique to the rainforest of far north Queensland. So it's you know, it's something that I feel and my people so proud of that. And this goes back to probably one of my earliest collaborations, and it started with collaborating with family, an understanding of who I was and where I was at in living and working in Brisbane, and the few and far opportunities that come to our young generation that might live in more regional and remote areas. And working with family is something really important to me because I don't want anyone to feel that they don't have this opportunity or options of expanding, you know, not only, you know, where they choose to live or how they choose to live their life or who they want to be, defined just by that location. I've been given so many amazing opportunities through the visual art world, and I don't kind of limit that access to what I've had to anyone around me. And that's why I think where this work came from, and a little bit more information, it was to be included in a show called Optimism at the Queensland Art Gallery at the time. Unfortunately, this wasn't the work that I ended up using for that show, but I decided to still give it the title of Optimism in recognition of that and where my thought was there at that point in time. Keeping in mind 2008 was the year that the then Prime Minister gave the apology to the stolen generation. There was a number of significant moments for me in that time frame, which was making me think about the idea of optimism or optimism in the face of adversity.
Mm. Well, I'm keeping on this next suite of images. You know, I just hope I get this right, the pronunciation of it. Is it Yinan Madjemi? Is that how I say it?
Yinamajimi, yes.
Imagining. And the rough translation seems to be "Thou didst let fall," and it's a body of work from 2014 through to 2015-16. And I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about Eddie Albert and provide a context for these works.
Sure. This is, I don't think it's not so much complex, but the span and width of things that had come out of this was quite incredible. I had always been touching upon within my work, but not in an extensive body, the story of my grandfather. It was something that we were all kind of made aware of as we grew up. We knew his story. He actually passed away the year before I was born. It just intrinsically, things started to come closer and closer together. And through the small work I had done about my grandfather, the Australian War Memorial approached me about being what is considered a war artist. And for a lot of people listening, they might have heard of, you know, Ben Quilty went to Iraq, I think. Exter Medici traveled, I think, to Timor. There's a number of artists, and I possibly am getting that wrong, but have technically done what a war artist was, someone who was involved in the military that had artistic talents and would be utilized during those front lines. The War Memorial had this idea of then actually getting contemporary based artists or conceptual artists to go and be with the infantry wherever they are, and to explore those ideas similar to the war artists, but in a much kind of different context. So I went to Norforce, which is Border Security and Sea Patrol, which goes from the Torres Strait all the way over to Broome, a very expansive area. And that took a lot of convincing. I said no like a zillion times. I had incredible issues within Australia's treatment of refugees and our border security and our sea patrol, like the sea waters, the ownership over that, like Australia's rights extend right to almost like the shoreline of Indonesia, that claim to property, I think. But they wore me down, and I ended up going, and it changed, very much my perspective. I learned a lot of things that I guess I didn't know, but also at the forefront of Norforce is Aboriginal servicemen and women. So these are trained infantry attached to Australia that live in such remote areas that people aren't deployed to go there, servicemen and women. They're communities of literally a couple of houses. So I was learning, things like one of the biggest exports within Australia is cultural objects and artifacts that are supposed to remain in this country under kind of law. So I had to a bit bite my tongue and realize that that there was a great lot of work being done. And again, that idea of visibility and invisibility, we don't see or hear about people like Norforce. We don't really know and understand that on that barrier, our first line of defense is our Indigenous people. And they're known in communities as greenskins. So up across the Northern Territory, I mean, all over Australia, but it is particular to certain areas, we have what are called skin names, and that delineates your maybe a hierarchy within the community. It might mean you're a songman for something. It might mean that you have cultural responsibilities in some way or some form. But if you are with the army, you literally get a skin name called a greenskin, and that those duties actually override your community duties. So there is to me, that is an incredible way of showing how culture has always changed and moved. It was, there's this idea that culture was stagnant, and it just never was. It was always evolving. And that's a real amazing contemporary example of, how culture is fitting in within this kind of new contemporary world. And I'm going on a big tangent here, but that really grounded me in the fact that I was doing this work and I wanted to do more about it, which led to this, what we see in front of us, which is a memorial to Aboriginal and Torres Strait servicemen and women. It made me research and uncover so much more. Since the Boer War, Indigenous men and women have fought for this country. And this, mind you, is also excluding colonial wars, which I think are a whole other issue in their own right and deserve so much time and energy. And so I'm not speaking about that, but I'm talking about from the Boer War in the very early 1900s, where we had Aboriginal men deployed, and then we introduced what was known as the White Australia policy. And these men, and I'll say men in that one because it wasn't until the Second World War, first and second, that women were very much involved in that, but that they were not allowed back into this country. So we're talking about people that went and fought for this country and then were denied access coming back to this country. And this is not a part of our vernacular. This is not a part of what we understand when we think about the Anzacs or people who fought for us. There's an incredible amount of injustice attached to some of these stories. And then I progressed and learned more about my grandfather's story, and this was going back to the Second World War. So then we had a war between that, which servicemen and women were intrinsically involved in. In fact, per capita, the Torres Strait had the most amount of servicemen and women than anywhere else in Australia. The story that is attached to this piece, is significant. It's a great heroic story of survival. But in uncovering and trying to do something like a memorial, within the sense of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander servicemen and women is that it wasn't as simple as just a list of names. That actually is inaccessible. You couldn't enlist if you were an Aboriginal person. So you had to either give another ethnicity or it kind of was turned a blind eye because this country needed the bodies, they needed the people to be enrolling, but you actually couldn't enlist as an Aboriginal person. So I really wanted, I didn't want this memorial to be, I guess, a memorialization of war, kind of in a good way. I wanted to kind of tell these hard truths attached to it. I didn't want it to be, I guess, be romantic or be something beautiful. It's hard, but it should be. I didn't want people to look at it and feel comfortable. And I guess, yeah, and it did come from, I guess, the confidence I had as an Indigenous person in using a story that I was, felt appropriate to use, but one that was metaphoric of the amazing legacy and work that Aboriginal servicemen and women had within those times that was just completely unrecognized. And going through archives and having people named in photos and then unidentified Black people in those photos. So, they're just, the obsolescence of these heroic gestures just had become so clear within, that family story, but then within my further research. And it ended up being a much larger, more significant body of work, and something I do come back to occasionally in my practice now.
Thanks.
Sorry, that's a long answer, and probably I don't know if I answered it correctly.
I think you answered it really, really well, and I think those ideas about hard truths and discomfort, and just reminding people that what we think about in terms of being Australian, that actually that experience of being Australian or that experience of history is not necessarily shared by all Australians. There are multiple experiences of being Australian.
But war, was one that, that spirit we believe in with that Anzac, I really felt that it was that connection that could be had. As as non-Indigenous Australians, we really, there is a pedestal held up to those people. And if we can use that story and bring in that Indigenous component of disadvantage, then I think, for me, success comes when you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you can use something that exists for people to make that comparison for. So it's also understanding when servicemen and women return to Australia, they were given land as part of their settlement. However, Aboriginal servicemen and women, when they returned, did not receive that. They were still getting their land taken off them. They were still getting their children taken off them. They were fit to fight for this country, but they weren't fit to be parents of their own children. So I think it's a very significant one in bringing a closer understanding to people who don't necessarily, it just not even a thought in their mind about that disparity, but they get that Anzac spirit, that energy, and it brings people closer to that truth.
This image is from the 2018 exhibition from Visible, and then there's other works from 2017, 2011. But I'll just go back to that image from the Queensland. Hang on. There we are. I've gone too far ahead. I wonder if you could tell us what is Aboriginalia and what interests you about this material?
Sure. Well, Aboriginalia is simplified. It's not a word. People say I made it up. I don't believe I made it up. Like it just, you add alia onto anything and it becomes part of something. But it is primarily kitsch Australiana with images of Aboriginal people emblazed upon it in some way, shape or form. No one has not seen this stuff, but it was particularly, I'm not going to say relevant, irrelevant for me as a child. It was that I was just, I guess, in that moment in time was when this was at its most unfashionable. Like, you could not literally pay someone to take this stuff away from you. I was 6 years old. I came from a very modest, low socioeconomic family. Our lives were secondhand shops. That's where we ascertained everything we had in life. And it is where I came across this imagery and I fell in love with it. Actually, from the innocent eyes of a child, I really believe that these were quite famous Aboriginal people. Like, how do you get on a plate or a cup or a wall hanging? It's through some kind of elite elevation. There was no understanding at all of the complete sinister undertones that were attached to it. But I had this little growing collection, and I was a kind of a weird child. I didn't play with toys. I displayed them, and I had little weird collections growing in my bedroom. I was a big collector of Smurf figurines, which were distributed through BP service stations in the 80s. But yeah, it was a love for secondhand shops, and then a love for this iconography that grew and was growing and amassed to this point as a teenager, as a collection that I could no longer actually store within the confines of a living situation. So it moved from there to my house, to my studio, purely as storage. And it wasn't until in my creative zone that I was interacting with these objects that I started to unpack them more in an artistic sense, if that makes sense. They were on my mind within an artistic mind framework. And the first thing I actually started to do before these big text-based works, I would just arrange things. One day, if I was doing nothing, I'd just put all plates together, or ashtrays, or the color orange. I just would just be tactile, for a better sense of the word, just immersing myself in the objects, and I'd start to make shapes. And actually, this is a good slide because Headhunter was the very first text-based work that came out of the Aboriginalia. And I was just pulling out heads. I became very fascinated within the context of Aboriginalia. What does it mean to hang someone's head on a wall? And Headhunter became the first work using Aboriginalia. And that, I guess you can say, and that's history. That's where it all started. The encompassing. I look at it kind of like tidal waves. That all these objects came into me, and then I found a way to release them back into society, but making the objects have a voice and making sure those objects were heard in a way that they had never been heard before. They were given the strength and they were given the power in the conversation. And well, that's how I see the work anyway. But I'm so grateful that, when I watch shows about collectors and hoarders, and they have such incredible issues in their mind, that I was able to find a release, there was no ownership anymore over that work. Actually became important that they were filtered back out to society in this way. But that's where I often look at all those political undertones of the work that it's so strong and it's so clear. It's text, you read it. However, I always go back to that innocent childhood perspective of love. And I think that is important for me to keep grounding my work within that framework as well, that these didn't come from an angry place. They actually came to me through love. And I hope they're coming back to people with love attached to them.
Well, just on that, we've had words that are used in these works: exotic other, hopeless romantic, whitewash, ash on me. Whose voices are these words? Like, where are these? Are they your voice? Are they? Where do these voices come from? Who's speaking these words?
Within something like Ash on Me, there were ashtrays included in the very first work, Headhunter, and I ended up taking them out because there was something much more sinister attached to the ashtray in terms of its metaphorical connotations to what I was, in the way in which I was looking at the objects, that I always felt the ashtrays, rightly so and deservingly so, had their own work within them. However, I think I just quickly lost my train of thought. But then, so they quite distinctly sometimes relate, like exotic other. I was really picking things out of the collection which either played up to the noble savage or the very cute and vulnerable children. So I think people really don't understand the access I have to these objects through my collection. It is quite crazy. Like I trawl through it and often find the right pieces that fit. But then there are other moments in like the text-based pieces on velvets or the screen prints. I don't know if I'm sharing too much, but I would actually sit it on my bedside table or sometimes sit it on the pillow next to me in bed. And I would sleep with the object, and in the morning, it would tell me what the text was. So it's not an instant thing for me. It is process driven. It is about looking at, and then I do believe there is some kind of dreamlike or something symbiotic between who I am and what the object is, our histories, our relations, something. But I often refer to the fact that the objects speak to me, not the other way around.
I want to take you.
I feel like I'm going to be leaving here in a straitjacket. And
no, it's so great to hear you talk about these objects that then get incorporated into these bigger domestic structures. This one is Native Home from Art Basel, Hong Kong, and I really wanted to give people tuning in a sense of the scale of this work, and also this work, which whilst it doesn't incorporate, the material from previous works, it's another work. This is Healing Land, Remembering Country, that was installed at Cockatoo Island at NIRIN. But it's another work that kind of references home. And I wonder if you could tell us what home means to you.
Yeah. Home is country. Language is attached to the idea of home. Within Indigenous language, it brings our humanity so much closer to the land that we walk on. I actually recently heard someone to refer to humanity as an earthling, which I really loved, because I was like, that connects us to the land rather than humanity, which makes us part of something separate to it. But say a heart and home in language translates together. The skin on a tree in most Aboriginal languages also refers to the skin on our bodies. So it connects, it just brings things one or two steps closer to understanding we are part of the land. And that, to me, is what home is. It's not about where I'm actually sitting. It's about positioning and understanding where I sit on this earth. And this work came out of that premise. And more recently, I had a brilliant opportunity to go to a climate school on Heron Island. For me, being someone concerned with climate and what is happening to the world, to now what I believe a complete advocate for the climate change movement, it completely changed my life and scared me, I guess you could say. And I started to think in the context of NIRIN about my work becoming plants, so the thing with this work is you gift a memory to the earth. So it's not just about rejuvenation of land, it's healing of land, where the name comes from. But it was, I think, just really important to me to do something that it wasn't just about me, it was interactive and just fit within, I guess, my real current concerns, which are attached to the environment. And we've seen such devastating things, particularly in the last 12 months, happened. The rejuvenation of land is so important, but I think the core of your question is home. So I definitely feel, as an Aboriginal person, I feel I know where I sit, I know where my family is, I know our story places, but home, you know, everyone should understand, and you know, you gave a very beautiful acknowledgement of country. You know, what is that country that we live on, and why, you know, that there is a connectedness to that, which is so important, because when you think like that, you start to change your attitude towards the land as well. I feel you're even less likely to throw a bit of rubbish on the ground when you are constantly thinking about your attachment to something. And I think that's, you know, so important at the moment.
Mm. Now we come to this very recent body of work, Wrecking Ball, which exists as collages and a video. We haven't got the video, but I've got this suite of collages. And look, for me, there's something really interesting about this very homemade, cut and paste nature of the collages compared to the very sort of refined, super monumental bronze of Captain Cook. And then you throw Miley Cyrus into the mix, and, you know, perhaps you could just talk about that process and, you know, and maybe even the global kind of toppling of sculpture.
Sure. And not to forget humor. I don't want to leave humor out of this conversation, because, you know, for me, it was incredibly fun. And I think there's a bit of like what we call blackfella humor attached to it. But this work was planned earlier this year. It's something that I'd wanted to do for a while, but then I was invited to participate in the Cairns Indigenous Art Fair, which is something that I'm always a part of in terms of collectors and curators and advocating for art from North Queensland, where my family is from. It's very unique. It's very beautiful, and it needs more intention. When we look and think about Aboriginal art, it's very much attached to, you know, Western Desert ideas and styles. Yet Aboriginal people all over Australia work in so many different forums and so many different styles of identification of who we are, and the replica endeavour that was going to be circumnavigating Australia this year was going to be docked at Cairns during the art fair. So the director, Janina Harding, was interested in doing a show which kind of rebutted that idea, or gave a very different insight into colonial history. And I was like, oh man, I've been thinking of this artwork. Oh, and I should mention in Cairns, and I wish I had an image of it. There is a ginormous statue of Captain Cook with his hand raised up in the air. Like, that was my childhood, driving up into Cairns and just looking at this thing going, I just never ever understood it. It is just the ugliest thing you have ever seen in your life. And I knew, and that was the first thing in my mind. That's the one I want to tear down. I want to just get rid, because it's like doing a Nazi salute. It's so, to me, it epitomizes a North Queensland upbringing and understanding of, you know, the mindset of mainstream Australia. And of course, you know, this year came about, everything got locked down. The Institute of Modern Art wanted to do these little projects that could give artists an opportunity to do something in their home, or just keep artists working in a time where that could possibly be impossible. And I said, look, I've been wanting to do this work, and it could really fit in now that I can't do it in this forum. You know, I literally, you know, I'm swinging on a gym ball, those macrame to a rope behind a green screen, so it's so super lo-fi, and that was also the intention. Yeah, I was able to produce that work just from being at home. But then what happened was, the day we went to release it, the first statue went down globally in London, like literally within this Black Lives Matter movement. And I had all these people, you know, dear friends and people, you know, around the world going, how did you do that so quickly? Like, you know, you're so on the pulse. And I was like, no way, like, this was done before that happened. So I'm such a believer in global synergy. And I think, throughout history, fire just didn't start somewhere and then move. It just happened. Those things happen. And when you look at contemporary society, what we're listening to, music, information, the news, we're going to have these symbiotic ideas happen. And that's kind of what happened with this. It just coincidentally, my thought, my mind, me wanting to rip down these sculptures was exactly the kind of same. It was happening globally. Just coincidentally, those things collided at, the same time. And, I think where I tend to be a little more playful with it, though, is that, and knowing this country, it's like I couldn't actually rip down the real monument, but I could theoretically do it through just my imagination, and why not to a song like Wrecking Ball, which intrinsically, like, to Miley Cyrus's credit, like, it's had over 1 billion views as a film clip. Like, it's actually really risque, and kind of was doing something new within the idea of a film clip, but it just transferred itself so wonderfully, to this 40-year-old Aboriginal man with a little VB filled pot belly swinging across the scene. There's something almost so unattractive about it that I felt it could work. But I'm still mortified when I watch it. My mum looked at it and she just was like, "Oh, you are such an idiot." But I'm really, and then from that came a series of collages. So I want to say I always try to push ideas as far as they can. I had all the still images from the shoot that I was looking at, and I was like, well, I need to use these. And I don't like to just do one thing and then be like, I've done the work. All the scraps, all the research, all those materials, I end up making work out of. So I very rarely leave anything untouched in the studio that is a process of a work. I keep pushing that work in any way, shape or form I can.
Well, Tony, I'm going to stop asking you questions and go to the Q&A in the chat. But really, I do want to thank you so much for such incredible generosity and, for letting, for sharing all of that, for sharing your family with us, your sensibilities around home, for opening up about sleeping with objects near your pillow and talking to us about Miley.
I think I've said too much. Yeah.
No, you haven't said enough. We could go on more, but a couple of the questions that have come in. What is your definition of family in the context of locality and identity as an Australian?
Oh, well, I think, that idea of family was something I spoke about, understanding where we sit, where we are. For me, it's also been an ongoing attachment to those communities and people that I've had the great opportunity to collaborate with. I noticed very early in my work within the institution, I worked for the Queensland Art Gallery for 8 years in what I see as a previous life, but there was this tendency with institutions to attach themselves to things, but for a show or a short period of time. And it was just a very different way for me of working. So some of my relationships go right back to even being within the institution. And then when you work with people so intrinsically and so closely, they're part of your life forever. So it's not, uncommon on any given day for me to get phone calls from anywhere throughout Australia to have a chat. We've referred to each other as our brothers and sisters. And that is really because we keep, those relationships are so intrinsically important to me. So, family for me looks, about blood relationship, about country, but then it's the family you choose and make your own. And then it's through the people you meet. So, it's a very wonderful thing.
You're great. I'm going to jump to a question from Sangeeta. Much of the Aboriginalia seems to stem from a particular vintage era. Mm-hmm. What does Aboriginalia look like in today's society?
Make no exceptions in the fact that it still exists. You can go into any $2 shop now and find what I call or what I am referring to as Aboriginalia. And there is still a viewpoint that Aboriginal people are to be seen and not heard, and that is why that stuff exists. So I think what you find with Aboriginalia now is it's still about an authoritative voice or ownership over us as people. So the imagery might have changed, the way in which it's presented can slightly vary, but let's make it very clear that there is still an underlying viewpoint in this country that we are owned as people, and that is why I certainly believe that Aboriginalia still exists through any way, shape, or form. And it could be the difference between appropriation and appreciation. It's a very, very fine line. I still see it in contemporary art made by people who are very much held up in the contemporary art world, that I see as an abuse of Aboriginal or cultural imagery. So yeah, it absolutely still exists. It just, the framework is different.
Before we just go to the next question, I do want to let people know that Georgina Binns, and special shout out and welcome to Georgina from our research library, has posted a link to the library's resources on Tony's work, which includes catalogues and other references. Murray's asked the question, is the external war sculpture being allowed to weather and build up a patina, or will it be polished?
There are the two elements. The standing bullets themselves are made with a patina to hold, that is supposed to be like that. The fallen ones are Corten steel. Not only will they rust, they will actually bleed. And the definition between them in my metaphorical idea was that they were people who lived and people who died in this one particular story pertaining to my grandfather, where he was sentenced to execution. So yes, the answer is yes and no. There is part of it that is meant to be pristine, meant to be alive. The bullets in their capacity are representative of humans, and the fallen ones are those soldiers who did not return, and it is supposed to decay. There has been some defacing of the memorial, only very minor, but the City of Sydney gets in contact with those things, and I'm just completely like, just leave it. That's part of the scarring. That's part of the legacy. We have been scarred. We have, we've had violence against us. The fact that that's happening on this sculpture, it means nothing to me. It's like, yeah, that's what, my life is. That's what life for our people is. Probably everyone, we bear those scars. So I have a tendency not to, once it's done, it's done. If those things happen to it, leave it. But I think the city, tries to clean it off.
A question from Johanna. Tony, thank you for your wonderful, engaging presentation. I'm just wondering if you know what happened to the Indigenous soldiers that fought in the Boer War. Like, where did they go?
They're buried overseas, most of them in South Africa. There's grave sites. In my research, I counted over 60. However, it's been an ongoing project for a number of different people. But these men literally married. They married and had families outside of Australia. But yes, they're buried overseas.
And I think this will be our last question. It's another question from Marco. With the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, where a lot of statues are being pulled down and destroyed in order to tear down the significance and history of individuals associated with slavery or genocide, is the intention of the artist in effect, to try and erase history? So maybe you could just comment on, what do you think the intention of that process is?
I think it's definitely one of anger and frustration. It's an understanding of being in a point of history. And I look at it, when we see those things happening, there's globally they're different ideas, but they come back to kind of this center. And it's like, my grandparents dealt with life and asked for change. My parents asked for change. We're part of a generation now which has seen what has happened through asking for change. And that's what I don't like about this premise of violence. When you have been left with no other choice. If it's a bit like the Black Panther movement. It's like no one is going to, they would carry around guns. And the thing is, no one is going to call me a nigger when I'm holding a rifle. It's like there are moments where we bear arms because that is the only way in which we will be heard. And I mean, we don't have guns in Australia, but it's not even a case of lateral violence. It's actually just a case of standing your ground. So when I look at that issue, I think one, tear the statue down. 2, attach the appropriate history to that statue and an understanding of who that person was, why they deserve to be memorialized, and in what way do we do that? Or take it down and put it within the context of a museum. We should never, ever erase that history. It is part of who we are. It's part of what has made us, what has brought us to that point. I'm such a history buff. Everything, I want to know everything. I will try to at least understand everything. And we cannot, I don't think the answer is eliminating these things. So I get that frustration. I get that it is only in doing that these voices are being heard. But I would like to see those things kept now that they're down in some way, shape or form, and that we continue to inform, generations to come, even, hopefully if that history changes, we came out of the end of that. This is the process that led us to that. If we don't learn from our mistakes, we will just continue to make them, and that's what we're doing. So I think that erasing anything from history is definitely not the right thing to do.
Tony, we're gonna leave it there. Really, on behalf of everybody at the VCA, the Melbourne Reconciliation Network, our deepest thanks to you for just sharing and giving it all, and really congratulations on such an incredible body of work, a career that just. I don't know if it's so inventive, the places that you take your work, whether they're these intimate little collages or whether they're these big, expansive public pieces, or frankly, whether it's a conversation with the University of Melbourne community. Really, congratulations and our deepest thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. And I have been reading all the comments, so thank you to everyone. It really is a pleasure to just to be able to communicate and share stories.
Yeah, great. And look, thank you to everybody in our audience today, wherever you are in the world. We look forward to you joining us next week, where our guest speaker is Alex Danko. And yes, same time, same channel. Well, not the same channel. We'll send you the link. Take care, everybody.